There was once a place so pathetic, so awful, everyone laughed at it. People made fun of the way they dressed, their hygiene. People made fun of their lack of money, their lack of manners, their lack of all things civilized. It's a sad story today. It's a story of early medieval Europe. Now, it's interesting because this course is going to watch Europe go from the laughing stock of the world, a place synonymous with poop. And it's going to become the civilization that kind of wins the next 500 years. But we're not ready for that yet. Right now, we're still watching Europe in its pathetic disgustingness. And so let's see what we're talking about here. While China, I mean, they have bad moments, right? The Mongols, clearly a bad situation, right? Islamic world gets hit by the Mongols. I understand all that. But historically, the Chinese are amazing. Inventions and you name it. The Islamic world, amazing inventions, trade, you name it. And then there is Europe, who is sort of at the other end of the world at that time, anyway. They're backward, they're confused, they don't have a lot of contact with the rest of the world, and it's going to show. When we talk about the word medieval, by the way, it means middle. So if we go to like the Roman days, the Roman Empire would have been great. We call that the classical period. And then we get to around Christopher Columbus, and we call that the early modern period. And that actually is pretty good for the Europeans. It's this dark area in the middle, the Dark Ages, it has been referred to as. That's the Middle Ages, the period in the middle when things sucked. And that's what we have to talk about today. So, first of all, let's talk about government structure. You've got the Chinese with a civil service exam system. They've got educated people running the show. They know exactly what they're doing. They are very centralized. They have one emperor, and he's got a bunch of people working for him who are educated and smart in theory and who are running the show beautifully. Europe, on the other hand, is not centralized. There's not one central power calling all the shots and able to function. They are decentralized. Now, I know you think of the Middle Ages, and you, in your mind anyway, imagine all these, these knights running around, fighting with each other all the time, and all these great kings in control who are very rich and powerful. Yeah, not so much. Not really for much of the Middle Ages. You've got kings who really aren't that powerful. There are all these nobles who own the land of Europe. These nobles, because they own land, can afford horses and suits of armor, so they become the knights. They become the military force of this society. They're the ones with the real power. The kings, oftentimes, I mean, look at the first real king of France in this period. He's chosen by the other knights. They picked one of their weakest, poorest amongst them to make them king. Why? Because they don't want some powerful king telling them what to do. So a lot of the kings are not that rich, not that powerful. And so that means they rely upon the rich lords, these knights, to run their kingdoms for them. So if you're one of these nobles, you're in a sweet spot here. Because you own farmland, you are wealthy. Now, you're not getting your hands dirty. Come on, that's disgusting. But you are the owner of this farmland, and whatever is produced there by the people on it is more or less yours. That's where your wealth comes from. Now, why do you have this land? Well, because it was passed down to you from generation after generation after generation. Technically, the whole kingdom belongs to the king, but he lets you hand it down to your son and his son and his son and his son, as long as you make the promise of backing him up, providing military service in a fight. I mean, look at this, man. The king really doesn't even have his own army. He relies upon the nobles underneath him to show up when he calls them, or else he's screwed. That's what we mean by decentralized. In the United States, we have the United States Army that the president is the commander in chief of. This is different. This would be like if the president of the United States has no army and he wants to fight someone, he calls up the militia of Pennsylvania and gets the governor's permission. He calls up the militia of Alabama and they decide to put shoes on for once and come join his army. That's what we're talking about. So very decentralized. To put it in picture form, here is the kingdom. This rectangle is the kingdom. And of course, there is the king. Now, the king has a smile on his face. He's the king, right? He gets to wear a cool looking hat. Who doesn't want that? Problem is, the king can't govern the whole kingdom by himself. And he doesn't have a bureaucracy of educated people like China does. So maybe, for the sake of argument, he carves his kingdom up into 4 chunks and he lets his retainers, people who have been retained for their services, he lets maybe the 4 richest people in those areas run the show. Depends what part of Europe you're living in, but maybe this guy is called an archduke or something like that, right? Why is he the archduke? Because his daddy was the archduke, and so forth and so on, and the king uses this whole system. Fine. Good to be an archduke, except one thing. As an archduke, you also don't have a bureaucracy of trained government officials. And so a lot of times these knights would break up their land into a bunch of chunks. And of course, lesser knights would control those lesser chunks. It can get pretty ridiculous. I mean, take for instance this guy. Maybe he breaks up his land into 6 pieces. He keeps the biggest one for himself, and he hires these knights to govern the rest for him because he can't do it. But maybe some of these knights have territory so large that they themselves divide up their territory for even lesser knights and have them govern little pieces for them. I mean, it can get quite comical after a while. He hires them. Those guys hire those lesser knights. This lesser knight hires even more lesser knights. You start trying to figure this whole thing out. It makes your head spin. I mean, this guy's loyalty goes to him. This guy's loyalty goes to him. This guy's loyalty goes to him. And of course, this guy's loyalty goes to the king. Point is, if you're a king, you're not feeling too secure about this. I mean, let's say for the sake of argument, this guy's like, I want to be the king. So he, of course, calls up all of his knights to join him. And he's going to ride to the castle and mess with the king. Remember, the king doesn't have a lot of men of his own. So, of course, the king's going to get on his little medieval telephone and he's going to call up his main 3 guys. Because remember, they have the right to rule that land because they promised to provide a military service. So in theory, this guy right here gets on his medieval telephone and calls these guys, and this guy calls these guys, and this guy calls this guy, and this guy calls these guys, and then they all show up and defend the king. Unless they don't, right? If you're a king, this could go horribly wrong. What if this guy teams up with, I don't care, this guy? And what if the king calls this guy, but this guy's like, I'm busy right now? I mean, the king could be in real trouble. So this is the kind of ridiculous chaos we're talking about when we say that kings aren't nearly as strong in medieval Europe as we like to pretend on TV. Well, anyway, I would argue then the real power resides in the nobility, these knights. They provide military service in exchange for these plots of land that they get to govern over. In these plots of land, they're not working in the fields, we said, but they do have jobs to do. I mean, they are the only government there. When someone steals someone else's chicken, it's the knight's job to be like, all right, did you steal the chicken? Give the chicken back. Or cut their head off as a punishment for stealing the chicken. It all depends on what it is. So knights are the army of medieval Europe, but they're also the police force. They're in charge of meting out justice. If you need irrigation in your farmland, they're in charge of organizing the farmers to go out and dig ditches to bring water in. I mean, these knights have a full-time job of governing. They are here's where the word comes from. They are the landlords, if you will. And they have the other job of being the military. Now, it's not a bad gig if you can get it. A lot of money, a lot of wealth to be had. If you don't screw up, you can pass it down to your oldest son. And that land with the title goes throughout your family line. What are these titles we're talking about? It all depends. Maybe you're the Archduke of Louisbury. There's something coveted. Maybe you're called the Duke or the Count. In England, they don't use the word count, they use the word earl. In Germany, they use the term baron. If you see von in front of a name, it's because at some point they were barons, right? So anyway, point is, it depends on the country. We don't really care that much. But when you have the right to rule over that land, you were given a title, and that says you are something special. Well, what is this land that you were ruling over that is covered in poop? Well, it's called the estate, or it's called the manor. The Lord, that's the knight, he's the one in charge of the manor, which is basically like a big super farm. Now, we said the Lord doesn't get his feet all in the poop every day. He's not working his fingers to the bone. There are serfs that do that. The little people, the farmers. Now, serfs are tricky. It kind of goes back to the Roman Empire when there was slavery. There's not slavery anymore in Europe at this point. But serfs are kind of a weird middle ground. They are poor peasant farmers. But unlike a peasant, these guys don't have a choice. They are tied to the land. Now, not with a rope, but they are legally obligated to stay on that land. So here's a picture representation. You've got the manor, that's the whole big green rectangle, and you've got the manor house, which of course looks like a castle, and it is a castle because medieval Europe is a very violent place where lords are constantly fighting against each other. You need to have a building that's fortified so all the poor peasants can run inside with their goats and hide when marauders come through. Now, of course, the Lord lives in this house with his people, but he also has the nicest, biggest plot of land that's all for him. Whatever that's produced here is all his. Then, of course, the rest of his manor is broken up into smaller plots where these little guys, the serfs, get to farm with their families. So this guy does not own the land that he's on. He rents it. And he doesn't even have a choice. He has to rent it. That's what it means to be a serf. Now, if you're a serf, good news! You get your own plot. And 3 days a week, you're allowed to work it. Go out there, do what has to be done. Plow the fields, harvest the stuff, pick the weeds, pluck the chickens, whatever's got to be done. Bad news! The other 3 days a week, you have to do the Lord's work. I don't mean Jesus. I mean the Lord of the manor. So 3 days a week, this guy gets to work on his plot, doing his work. And then 3 days a week, whatever those days would be, he's got to go over to the Lord's land and harvest the grain, fix the fence, gather firewood, slaughter the hog, whatever the Lord needs done. Because remember, the Lord's not doing anything. So if you're one of these serfs, you're a pretty bitter guy, probably, right? 3 out of every 6 days, you are working on the Lord's land, doing his work, when your fields could certainly use the tending. Whatever work you do over here, all the profits, when it's sold, goes to the Lord. Why do you do it? A, because that gives you the right to have your own little plot for 3 days a week. And B, because you're legally obligated and you will be killed if you try to leave. That's what sucks about being a serf. Now, you might say, now, Mr. Kerstetter, I'm no genius on the calendar, but there are 7 days in the week. That is true. Except the Catholic Church, being the force that it was in medieval Europe, would not allow lords to work their people on the Sabbath day, on Sunday. So 3 days a week on your land, 3 days a week on the Lord's land, and 1 day a week you'd have to go to Mass at the local Catholic Church. And so you're still not getting to work your land. But hey, it sure beats going into the fields. So as a serf, you kind of are a package deal. You come with the land. When a new lord takes over, he inherits the land and you on it. You cannot leave. You cannot move to some other lord's farm unless your lord gives you permission. You are just stuck there. Now, maybe the manor has some towns on it, maybe even a little city. That'd be ideal, right? If you're a lord, not only can you extract money from the farm work of your serfs, but you can charge taxes To the city dwellers, there's probably a wood plot somewhere on your land to collect firewood, to go hunting. By the way, hunting, interestingly enough, was a gentleman's sport in Europe because no one was allowed to kill things in the woods except for the Lord. Because if everyone could go, then they would, and then there'd be nothing left for the Lord to kill. On this manor would probably be a mill of some kind that the Lord would have built to grind the wheat into flour. And by the way, if you are our little serf guy there, poor and miserable, when you take your wheat to the mill, they're going to keep some of it as a fee for you using the mill. The mill you have to use because you're not allowed to leave. So again, if you're a serf now, you're getting squeezed again, and they're taking even more of your stuff. Boy, does that get your goat. So if we look at medieval Europe, then it is not particularly impressive. Not a lot of science going on, right? Remember, science happens in cities. Inventions happen in cities. They don't happen here in the farm, really, because these guys have a full-time job of farming for food. Now, look, are there going to be inventions? Sure, like new kinds of plows and new farm implements, sure. But they're not artists, per se. They're not creating great music. They're not building the next cool university. And since there are very, very, very few decent sized cities in Europe at this point, that's my point. Europe is backward, it is poor, it is violent, it is probably one of the worst places in the world in the medieval period.